Okay, we are here on the crowded floor of WonderCon with Michael Allen Nelson, writer of 28 Days Later, Hexed, and Dingo, and we're here to talk about his creator-owned book, Dingo. How's it going? How's your convention?
It's been great. It's been a lot of fun, yes.
Now, it's kind of like a fever dream mixed with a bunch of Greek myths. Where did the story ideas for Dingo come from?
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting. It's one of those things where you sort of take personal events that are happening to you and you amplify them to like the nth degree. And so this is not to say ill of anybody in my life. I don't read that into it. But so what I did was I basically took some things that were happening to me at the time and just sort of took them and said, well, how can I, blow this up into something that's interesting? So that's sort of how it started.
This video is brought to you by TFAW.com. Visit TFAW.com today and use the code WONDER at checkout to save $5 on your next purchase of $20 or more. TFAW.com.
It actually began as a novel that I wrote a few years ago. It's actually the story that started my writing career. So what had happened is I had written the novel, Ross had read it, really loved it, and said, hey, have you thought about writing comics? And that's what got me started into comic writing. And then of course fell in love with that and just really embraced that. And then recently Ross was like, well, let's adapt your novel as a graphic novel, which was a fantastic idea because I think when I did that, it actually made the story even better. And I mean, I'm just really, really proud of that graphic novel. I just think it reads wonderfully well, so very proud of it. But as far as the idea of the original story, it actually started as a writing exercise. I have a friend who's a very talented writer. Her name is Joanna Stokes. And poor thing, I forced her to read like this laborious, like epic fantasy I was working on. And it's like, I'm writing this novel, can you help me out? She read it and she was very kind and she's like, you understand that this really isn't your voice, because she'd read some other little things that I had done. So she's like, why don't you just go ahead, sit down, and write something that, just put that fantasy thing away, write something that's completely unique, that's completely you and your own voice. I'm like, okay, so that's how Dingo started, and I wrote the first chapter, and just thought to myself, this is fun, I'm really enjoying this, and then just started building from that. And as I would build it, I was like, oh, what if I went in this direction, or went in this direction? And I've always enjoyed planting little seeds so that will hopefully pay off later. Sometimes I do that not really knowing what those seeds are going to grow into. So, but it was fun when I was doing when I did Dingo of putting everything together, and I was really surprised at how nicely everything fit together in the book. So anyway, so that's kind of like my long roundabout way of saying how it came about. So.
Well, like there's a lot of elements to it that are relatable, like evil ex-wives and strained family relationships and things like that. But then it kind of has this over-the-top supernatural element. So
yes.
That must have been really fun for you to put together.
It was a lot of fun because I've always been drawn to fantasy and supernatural stories, and to be able to do a story that starts off almost like a pulp kind of story, very normal. And then slowly evolve into sort of that urban fantasy. To me, that's just, I've always found that to be a lot of fun. Because what that does for me as a reader, when that happens, when you finally see the magic, it becomes something terribly profound. And especially in a case like Dingo, because when it finally hits, it hits in a big way. And so when you lay the groundwork, the reader doesn't feel like you're cheating. It's sort of like it's telegraphing that those elements exist in that work, but you don't really see it. And it also is part of his character that he actually tried to actively avoid that part of his life for reasons that are kind of explained in the story. So it all comes together and all works. But I just like that aspect of there's something magical and dark and yet beautiful underneath the mundane world that we live in.
And of course, Dingo takes like quite a beating, spoiler, throughout the book. It wasn't really clear for me. Is there something about him that is magical, or is it just that he has kind of married into this kind of a band of furies, basically?
Yes. Spoilers ahead. Beware. But yes, he's not magical himself. He married into that world. Also, if you've read the story, you notice that his mother obviously is in that world. His Aunt Sarah is also in that world. And in a way, you can kind of see that these women have sort of tried to keep him out of that, perhaps for his own safety. And you know, it's so, and I like the idea of him not being aware and sort of like learning as he goes, and that serves not only as an example of who his character is in the world that he lives in, but it also serves as a sort of literary technique. As Dingo learns, the reader learns. So, and as far as him getting beat up, that's one thing that was quite intentional. I wanted to start him, you know, sort of picture perfect, and just gradually beat him up until he's just this massive, like, scarred. Yeah, I'm notoriously mean to my protagonist, so.
Well, it seems like it's really open for sequels. Are you planning any sort of sequel?
I have plenty of ideas. I would love to do sequels. I know exactly how the next story begins, and it's off to the races. So, you know, honestly, the question is, as soon as I get a green light to do more, more is definitely on the way.
So how does this compare between writing, you know, your own stuff and then something like 28 Days Later, where you kind of have a stricture and a certain universe that you have to, you know, live in?
Right. Well, both have their pros and cons. Obviously, when you're writing a licensed project like 28 Days Later, there are set parameters that you can't go outside of. And that can be sort of constricting in a creative sense, but also refreshing because you're limited. And it's easier to have those boundaries. Whereas something like Dingo, where I have room to do whatever I want, initially, well, that's great. But sometimes if you have this really fun idea, well, how do you make that work within the context of the story? So, you know, sometimes there's a drawback to having too much freedom. So it's a different, you have to approach it differently. But it both have their, like I said, both have the pros and cons.
Well, what's coming up next for you? You're continuing on to 28 Days Later. Is there anything you can tell us about on the bend? Yeah, well, 28 Days Later is about to wrap up. I actually finished writing the final script a couple weeks ago. Very happy the way that shaped up. I have a series coming out called Insurrection. Insurrection 3.6. It's a story that was created by Blake Masters, and I'm helping him adapt that into a comic book. And it's about androids and their struggle for autonomy, which is a lot of fun. And I also have another series coming out called Malignant Man, which sounds a little off, but it's a lot of big fun. It's about a guy who discovers that he in fact is not dying of cancer, and sometimes kind of wishes that he was. So, but that's an idea from director James Wan that I'm helping adapt as a comic as well. So it's just a lot of fun stuff around the bend. Great. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for talking to me.
Brought to you by Tfal.com, the world's best online retailer of comics and collectibles. Whatever you're into, we've got just the thing for your collection.